It says preparing live. Um, I'll just check on YouTube. Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Jai Bhim, and welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma, and today we are going to talk about a very important theme. Also, in the time when we just celebrated Phule's Jayanti yesterday, and we will be celebrating Baba Saheb's anniversary on the 14th. And today, on the 12th, is Sardar Hashmi's anniversary. The legend who started the if we can call it the fashion of street theaters and protests. And what a better day to talk about Andolans. Andolan archives is what we are going to talk about today: sexuality, caste, history. And to talk about that, we have Professor Anjali Arondekar, who is a Peggy and Jake Baskin Foundation Presidential Professor of Feminist Studies. She was the founding director, Center for South Asian Studies, University of California, Santa Cruz, 2020 to 24. Her research engages the comparative poetics and politics of sexuality, caste, and historiography with a focus on Indian Ocean studies and South Asia. She is the author of For the Record on Sexuality in the Colonial Archive in India, which was published by Duke University Press in 2009, and in India it was published by Orient Blackswan in 2010. Winner of the Alan Bray Memorial Book Award for the best book in lesbian, gay, or queer studies in literature and cultural studies. Modern Language Association 2010. She is the co-editor with Geeta Patel of Area Impossible, the Geopolitics of Queer Studies, GLQ, the Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies 2016, and with Sherene Seikaly of Pandemic Histories, History of the Present in 2022. Her second book, Abundance, Sexuality is History, which was published by Duke University Press in 23, and in the same year it was published in India by Orient Blackswan, grows out of her interest in the archival figurations of sexuality, caste, and historiography in British and Portuguese colonial India. And she is currently working on a third project, tentatively entitled Oceanic Sex, Archives of Caste and Indenture, that couples the archival forms of indenture with the oceanic voyages of caste and sexuality. Thank you so much, Anjali, for accepting this invitation. We are honored to host you this evening. And without further ado, I hand over the command to you of today's session, and I'll see you after the lecture. Those who are watching us can always, as I always say, can send their questions via the Zoom, via the YouTube chat, not the Zoom chat, but YouTube chat, which I will be reading out towards the end, and we will be having a Q&A towards the end of the lecture. Over to you.
Thank you, Shukriya, Ishan, and Jai Bhim to everybody. It's curious that Ishan mentioned Hashmi because I have a big photograph taken from Chakka Jam, one of the last things he did, and it's a huge, wonderful image that you see as soon as you enter my house. So towards Andolan we go. What I wanted to do today was also dedicate my brief meditation to many of the scholars who have been incarcerated. Uh, um, I can't think of polite words, but you know what I mean, for their voices of dissent. And I'm thinking particularly, as I sit here in the United States, of my comrade Mahmoud Khalil, who continues to be in custody for his dissent and for his support of Palestine, for Omar Khalid, who continues to remain incarcerated, and Gulfisha Fatima, whose poetry reminds us of the imaginations that rest despite all the repression. Of course, there are many, many more one can go on with, but I wanted to signal at least the memory of these three people who remain with us and who invite us to keep fighting as we stand. So what I thought I'd do today was just talk a little bit about the book that I just published, even though I'm working very much on a new book. because I wanted to say something about where we are in the current moment, particularly as we are renewing debates around caste as if they ever went away, and of course the role of history, both public, private, WhatsApp, YouTube, etc., within these conversations. So let me begin. I'm an old auntie, so I can't do the teleprompter, so you'll have to forgive me because I'll look down as I'm reading because it's still a more comfortable form for me. I am not your data, nor I am your vote. I am not your project or any exotic museum object. I am not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor am I the lab where your theories are tested. I am not your field, your crowd, your history, your guilt, your medallions of your victory. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. I make my own tools to fight my own battle. For me, my people, my world, and my Adhivasi self. So writes Abhay Khaka, as someone many of you probably know, an Adivasi scholar, activist, artist, in an excerpt entitled, from a poem entitled I Am Not Your Data, which was published in 2011, in what remains, to my mind, one of the most militant and poignant tracks of anti-caste aestheticism and politics. Khaka, a member of the Kuruk community, born and brought up in Jaspur district, Chhattisgarh, India, died tragically of a heart attack on March 2020, unrelated to the pandemic. I had the pleasure of meeting and working with him very briefly in Mumbai right before he passed away. A stalwart of Adivasi land reform, Khaka was first and foremost an intellectual who pushed for radical imaginaries that would combat the datafication and dehumanization of his Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan kin. If one motif hums through his poem, it is the pressing, almost unbearable awareness of the privations of caste and the unction of history, as if to say, between who we are and how we are seen lies an unbridgeable metrics, an archive of algorithmic violence that won't let us breathe. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar, he writes in his limpid litany of refusals, exhorting us, his readers, to imagine vibrant historical vernaculars for Adivasi and Dalit Bahujan presence. Now, for the past decade or so, I have returned to Khaka's trenchant exhortations to think through my own discomfort with the evidentiary regimes that secure pathways to histories of caste, descent, and sexuality. To think about what it means to not be data fodder for a supply chain of knowledge that sees minoritized histories only through lineages of loss, erasure, and paucity. My work, both my recent work and the work that I'm currently doing, is thus in equal measure a diatribe, an exegesis, a theoretical meditation, and a historiographical experiment against the hermeneutical demands placed on the histories of caste and sexuality and the scripted mandates of evidence, geopolitics, and verification. It is an retrospect, or it is in retrospect rather, an agon between an état de rage and an état de grâce, a refusal of the show and tell proof that we exist historical method that requires archival erasure before it can imagine presence. The wager for me always is that archives of caste and sexuality are the interlude, the kala within the historical record, the alankar, the composition that would wean us away from our imaginaries of data gathering and of verification. As a refutation of such bureaucratized imaginaries, I turned instead in my previous book to the concept of abundance as a heuristic to advance a non-recuperative history of kala that embraces archival presence without return and without the fear of loss. My turn to abundance is less a seductive alternative to the evidentiary mandates of datafied histories of caste and sexuality. This is not an effort to say, look, we have so much, but rather to think about how we understand what we have. As I have repeatedly argued, we have afforded lavish attention to the effacement of caste histories and somehow left their efflorescence woefully under-theorized. A history of caste and sexuality full of joyous indiscretions and staged archives shaped and determined by histories of the past remains untold. To summon such a history of abundance, I want to proffer here is not to be restored to representation under continuing occupation, but to be set adrift upon more intrepid economies of meaning and sometimes dissonant forms. Perhaps such an abundance leaves us inarticulate, or we are daunted by the weight of its promise. I'm going to talk you through some archival images, but because I'm primarily a theorist of historical thinking, I wanted to get us to a place where we could imagine why we hang on to this origin story of loss when we think about histories of caste and sexuality in particular. Now, today, as we stand witness both here, meaning here in the United States, and in South Asia, to an unimaginable genocide of our Palestinian kin, such archival habits of show and tell prove that we exist, even more pressing and perhaps impossible to leave behind. We are literally watching a genocide unfold. We have a surplus of evidence, so clearly something is awry. As scholars as Palestinian scholars, such as Sherene Seikaly and Ariella Azoulay remind us so eloquently, to recuperate archives of Palestinian lives without theorizing our habits of representation is to reify what they say, quote, is the morality of members of colonizing societies and not the morality of the colonized, the racialized, the terrorized, the oppressed. If the colonial injunction of morality is to look, the anti-colonial one is to look for the truth, end quote. How then, I want to ask, do we invent an archival grammar of dissent to refuse metonymic deployment, to do more than to witness, to become, and indeed to inhabit a different order of collective presence? How do we move from keeping the story alive to keeping the subject alive? This is as true as it is in Palestine, as we see every day devastating violations of our Dalit Bahujan kin, and they have become so ordinary in their forms of evidentiary. On offer here today, then, are historical snippets of Andolan. Andolan, which can be dissent, protest, meditations that move beyond the heady inspirations of current dissent in India and in the US, and the stultifying violence of state practices. Andolan, after all, as many of you know, is also a movement in Hindustani music. I am from a community of Kalavan, so we always return one way or the other to Kala. So Alankar is a movement in Hindustani music, a kind of a combination, ornamentation of notes, to be specific, that oscillates between one fixed note and its counterpart, touching, suffusing all that lies in between. Now, through my research on the Dalit Bahujan Devadasi community, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, I have encountered such Andolan archives of invention, thriving ecosystems of protest, refusal, and pleasure. The Gomantak Maratha Samaj, as I will refer to it shortly as Samaj, is a historical anomaly and rarity, both in its archival form and content. The Samaj is a prominent lower caste Devadasi collectivity hailing from colonial Portuguese India and British India. Devadasi is a term that most of you here are familiar with, but just in case, it's of course a Sanskrit term that is falsely interchangeable with terms such as courtesan, sex worker, prostitute. Now, Gomantak in the title refers to geographical roots in Goa. Maratha is a term that was invoked at the time to include all subcastes of the community. But of course, Maratha is a term now that is involved in caste oppression in a different order. So I just want to signal the temporality of when the term was coined, as opposed to how the history of Marathas, particularly in the state that I come from, Maharashtra, has become such a contentious and violent term. Now, Samaj, of course, we know translates to both collectivity and society or community. Now, I have used the term Devadasi, despite the fact that many folks now prefer the term hereditary dancer, because that is the term the Samaj used, and I wanted to be faithful to the terms of their own definition. Now, moving between British and Portuguese India, I'm going to show you some images. Stay with me a little bit before we turn to the images which will give you a fuller sense of why this archive refuses the logics of show and tell, right? And gives us a different kind of imaginary of Andolan. So moving between British and Portuguese India, spread across the border states of Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka, the Samaj, to this day, is the only Devadasi community which has over 50,000 registered members. Now, that can also be a statistical black hole, because one registered member could mean an entire family or an individual. So counting is a little tricky when we come to then thinking about how many members the Samaj has. What's madly interesting about the Samaj is that it has maintained its own continuous archive since its inception in 1927 till today, right? Disavowing rather than disavowing or giving up or forgetting its history of caste and sexuality. It continues to publish its own version of its world. And today, the Samaj's publication is called the Goman Sharda. It used to be called the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, and it has been continuous since its inception. So we are now in 2025. Its archives in Mumbai and Panji are accessible and available to all that care to enter. This, for those of us who worked in South Asia, is a radical counterintuitive project because archives are mostly inaccessible, particularly when we think about minoritized histories. Now, these archives are full of the minutiae of subaltern life, an efflorescent, heady melange of fact and fiction with archival genres that corrupt and stage verifiability in the form of fake birth records, property deeds, and more. A canny archival pragmatism founds these collections where the sheer abundance of the materials is less an organizing than a disorganizing force, shot through by questions of pleasure, practice, and subjectivity. So let me turn now to these archives and talk you through what I mean by these questions. Okay. Now, this, of course, is the image, is the cover of my book, and we'll come back to why I picked this image. Let me move this up a little. So, voila. This, of course, for those of you who are historians or amateur historians in the audience, you know we find maps very dodgy. But I wanted to give you a sense of this map, even if you are well familiar with colonial history, because for the most part, people forget that Goa was colonized by the Portuguese and not liberated till 1961. And Goa is, of course, this little place sandwiched between the kind of grand monster that is British India. Now, these are some images which are from the official archives of the Portuguese state. This is a journal. So the archives that I work in are in 4 languages, in Kannada, Portuguese, Marathi, and sometimes in Modi. So this image is a conventional image, which if you've ever worked in colonial archives, you recognize the stylizations, where you have a nameless but attractive woman sitting on a cover as a kind of ethnological showcase of what is India, right? Now, I want you to keep these images in mind before we switch over to the images of representation that I will draw on from the Samaj's archive. This is another image which is, of course, also taken from archives in Lisboa, which is in Lisbon, which again is a typical thing we encounter even in the British archives, a colonial ethnographic showcase. So I speak Goan Portuguese, so if there are any Portuguese listeners and find my accent a little jarring, it is because of that. So in this little image before, you find a picture of a bailadera, which is basically a word that the Portuguese used as a broad general categorization for thinking about Devadasis, dancing girls. The distinctions were often collapsed. So now let's remember these two images. Now let's turn to the images from the Samaj. Now remember, the Gomantak Mahare Samaj is established in 1927, officially becomes an organization in 1929. And what I want you to pay attention to is how they craft their own archives, right? And what they do with the images of the archives that they have inherited in terms of stylization. So this is, most of you here read Devanagari, so I don't need to necessarily translate. But what I want you to notice is, this is, of course, the code book or the constitution. And it says, Gomantak Mahara Samaj Mumbai Sthapana. And then at the bottom, you have this odd quotation from Tennyson, right? So already you're seeing a kind of eclectic relationship to how archives should be assembled. This is, of course, another example from the Constitution. And the reason why I wanted to share this with you is if you look at it closely, it has very serious things like, this is what we should talk about, these are the rules of conduct, and very absurd things like, make sure to eat before you come to a meeting in case the meeting goes too long and you get too hungry, etc., etc. From the practical to the parodical to the kind of pioneering. This is a certification of registration, again, in order for the archives to function in this official manner as a manifestation of a Samaj, the Samaj had to be registered. Now, of course, if I'm happy to say more in the Q&A, but this is the 1930s, right? We are, as Eshan said, sandwiched between Foray and Ambedkar this weekend, and we know that the 1930s is an era of rapid and escalating anti-caste sort of organization. So it's significant that this Samaj is evolving during this period, but as you'll see, strangely uninterested in collaborations with other Dalit Bahujan communities. Now, let's remember that image I began with, where the woman is sitting in a very stylized way. And here you have an image from our Samaj archives, which is a calling card that women often use to procure yajmans, patrons. And in this case, if you know anything about fashion or clothing or design, you recognize the caste-coded sort of labor that goes into the staging of this image. Everything from the way the sari is put on and the jewelry, etc. And at the bottom, it says rendezvous, right? Which is an invitation. Very different from the very pretty image where the woman is looking sideways that you saw in the first image from the archives. This woman is looking directly at you and in some ways is not attractive in the ways in which we are used to seeing these images, but also completely uninterested, even as she is looking at us. Now, I'm going to show you a series of images from the Samaj Sudharak so you understand how their own canny pragmatism around archives emerges. This is I'm going to show you a series of images from the 30s and the 40s. This is a Samaj Sudharak from the 1933. And every Samaj Sudharak has an image of a woman, either photographic. At this point, photographs are not available. So, or graphic illustrations where a woman is either standing or looking and kicking a rock, which has rudi, basically tradition, custom, and it has something anti-Brahminical on it. So this is a very standard form of the Samaj Sudharaks, which begin, and you can see it says January 1933, Varshapats, meaning 5th year, Ank, etc. Now, again, these are images from the 1940s, and the one on the left is the one that I used for my cover. What's interesting about these images is how they are so beautifully stylized. They look like headshots, also because this is when we have the beginnings of an entertainment industry that is burgeoning in Mumbai. And a lot of these Kalavans are working as film stars, not film stars, they don't elevate to that level, as singers, as background actresses, all of these things. So the staging of the photographs is clearly taken from those archives. Now, what's super interesting about these images is one of the ways in which we remedy the violence of Brahminical representation, of colonial representation, is to say they erase us. They don't tell our names, they don't tell us who we are. And we saw that in the colonial representations of these communities, where we have an image with no name and no location. Now, in this context, when I was doing my archival research, the Samaj also has these images of women across the board, but we do not know who they are. So when I was doing my research, again, in a kind of habit of reading, I talked to some of the elders who were still alive and unfortunately have passed away since then, asking them who these women were. And all the response I got was, well, we know who they are. They're very familiar, right? So the invitation here in these images is less of, aha, we know who you are. Let's confine you to one form of identity, but rather, aha, we know who you are because you are our kin. There is something familiar about them. Now, as we move forward, I'll say more about why I picked that image and what it means to think about relationship, identity, caste, lineage in these forms that are not moored to one particular reading. Again, these are other images from the archives. You see they're very different in iteration, and there's a lot to say about them. I picked this one because clearly nobody was playing tennis at the time, but I play tennis now, and I wanted something of myself in the images that I saw. Now, this is one of the few images we have of domesticity. And again, the domesticity is empty of any male presence. So you can see at the back here, there is the Gandhian wheel, but of course the community is very critical of Gandhi, and I can say more about that anon. Now, this is, again, an image from the Samaj Sudharak, which was written by my father, who was the head of the student organization. And this was an editorial he wrote when he was 16, which is basically says, Ami Kaun. Now, many people have asked me, why is this book a queer history when it doesn't have anything to do with, entre guillemets, LGBTQ, etc. subjects? And my response to it always is that this project to me is more queer than anything I have done because it refuses the epistemological force of reproduction. And this is queer avant la lettre, right? So here is my father, who's 16, who's saying in this editorial, you are asking us not to look for our fathers or not to love our biological fathers. So why are you forcing us to love our mothers? Shouldn't we be allowed to choose the families we participate? So this is chosen family, but in a very different anti-bloodline, sort of anti-caste register. And again, I'll say more anon. Now, as I mentioned, these archives are full of different genres, right? Now, one of the genres that we are accustomed to seeing in minoritized archives, or we look for, as testimonials, right? We're looking for biographies, personal accounts that remind us of who people are. Now, there is only one particular biography in this archive, which is massive, and it's called Mikon. And it is, of course, written by this Rajaram Paingarnkar, who is one of the major leaders of the Samaj. Now, what is magnificent about this biography, and this is a little bit of a spoiler if you're bored enough to read the book, is that this biography is in 2 volumes. And in the first volume, the Paingarnkar tells us about this attack that happens on his family, which is an attack done by Brahmin youths who shoot guns and who devastate, who don't kill anybody, but frighten people. People run away and there is chaos. And in the second volume, he tells us, you know what? The thing I talked about, the attack, was nothing but a Saubhadra Natak, meaning what? It's something I staged because in order for us to get caste representation, in order for the Governor General of Portuguese Goa to recognize our labor as oppressed labor, we have to demonstrate that we have been oppressed. And the fact that we are Devadasis is not recognized as labor that is to be understood as violent or oppressive. So he says, you know what, let's stage an attack and create the ingredients of evidence so that when the Governor General arrives and sees broken houses and he hears people say, here we heard rumors of people threatening to kill us, we have all of the stories that are needed for a script of refusal, right, of dissent. Now, let's stay with this image for a while, and I'll come back to it. I'm going to stop sharing. We'll come back to this image towards the end. All right, now let me return to these archives now that you have seen a little bit about what I mean. Now, a second notable feature of the Samaj, beyond this self-archiving, canny pragmatism, as we saw in Paingarnkar, who stages a Saubhadra Natak, he gets his collectivity to stage his natak, doesn't tell his dear ones who are living in this complex with him because he wants their response to be real, right? So we have those examples of archival manifestations. But a second notable example or quality of the Samaj is their corruption of the endogamous structures of sexuality and gender that, as we know, suture caste to power. Endogamy, as scholars such as Durba Mitra have reminded us, founds colonial and post-colonial histories of society. It's a violent structure of caste and conjugality that scaffolds sexuality into zones of domestic and patriotic containment. Patriarchal, but these days patriarchal and patriotic, there is not much difference, right? Now, for Mitra, the political and epistemological imposition of caste-based endogamy is first by colonial ethnologists, Indologists, and then, of course, by homegrown Brahmin elites, systematically places non-conjugal sexuality, what Baba Sahib, of course, calls the problem of the surplus woman, as the source of civilizational, read Hindu disarray. So any refusal of this endogamy, as in the case of the Samaj, who have yajmans, who are Brahmins, and then have children who are clearly not Brahmin, poses challenges for a Hindu family form in which caste demarcates kin and conjugality. In bypassing the mandates of endogamy, the history of the Samaj proffers a more radical or perhaps even more chaotic caste narrative, in which there is no fixed inherited origin and where caste histories are always threatening to dissolve. If endogamy preserves the reproduction of caste as an inherited form through conjugality, then the Samaj's history of itinerant sexuality and non-conjugal kinships makes the permanence of caste both anomalous and temporary. So, for example, I was often accompanied by an elder from the Samaj when I was doing my research, particularly in Shiroda. Now, given that the Samaj members have Brahmin patrons, either through coercive or non-coercive relations, they often have surnames that are Brahmin, right? But obviously they are not Brahmin. And this is something you see all across Goa, Maharashtra, and Karnataka, right? So such caste mayhem and breakdown can be seen regularly in ways in which the Samaj members are often asked, and I have been asked that myself, even though neither my face nor my surname will ever lead anyone to think I'm Brahmin. And when I was working with this elder from our Samaj, Sunita Chandavarkar, whose surname, of course, has the distinctive stench of Brahmanism, when I was working with her and she was facilitating my local engagement with the Devasthans, the places where the archives of the temples are held, each encounter, the Mahajans, the priests, the bureaucrats would repeatedly ask her to explain the logic of her obviously Brahmin name, especially given the fact that she was clearly from a Devadasi Samaj. Chandavarkar's weary response, which to me is very allegorical to such inquiries, who are you? Why do you have this Brahmin name? Her response, uttered with mocking and measured irony, was always the same. Kam amse, now amse, khare ki khote, he kon tharonar. Our work, our name, who decides what is original or fake? So now moving between these nominalizations. So in some states, the Samaj is Dalit, depending on what subcaste you are talking about. In some states, it's OBC, open category. And so these caste modifications shift, as we know, as they shift for many castes in South Asia. Any robust anti-caste politics thus requires a balancing act between these two translations of caste. One that is embodied and the other which is regularized and sedimented within the judicial mandates of the state, which is why the debates around caste reservation are very central to the thinking of how we theorize caste, particularly through these entanglements with sexuality. Now, I grew up within the bawdy and colorful and expansive lower caste politics of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj. And it is those familial genealogies that have first opened me up to the urgency of caste, sexuality, and descent. My deliberations today, it's very important, thus emanate from these archival histories and familial intimacies. They are of them. They are epistemological. They're of them but they are not about them. There is no truth here to be revealed. Contravening the protocols of data collection, be they be of collectivity, family, caste, music, was not just a familiar form or feature of my Samaj life, but a profoundly political one. One's history was not a place of capture. It was a compositional lexicon of self-making to be continuously taught, modulated, inhabited, and shed. To return to Kaka's work, I can thus do no better than to tell that story. Now, in the little time that I have, I'm going to leave you with two examples of what I mean. So what I want to do is to suture Kaka's call for new idioms of protest, refusal, and survival to this Samaj's history of caste and sexuality, and proffer two sidelines of epistemic and material protest. And the two questions I want to invite you to think with me about are, how can a history of caste and sexuality, such as that of the Samaj, potentialize non-evidentiary futures for minoritized subjects? Meaning, how can we devise, imagine, theorize futurities that do not rely on a knowledge supply chain that demands data and evidence, right? In the ways in which we are forced to proffer constantly. How can such histories then clog up the data screen? Second, what happens if we turn to a theorization of radical caste politics, of Dalit Bahujan imaginaries as abundance, as Andolan, visions that cull the creative fury of the Bahu? Bahu, of course, is expansive, of lower caste subjects. Ambedkar's annihilation of caste always remains the horizon, even as attenuation remains the more immediate task. After all, the term Bahujan is, of course, of Pali Buddhist lineage and refers to a lexical register of transient diversity, covers all of the subcastes and including Adivasis, etc., cutting across religion, languages, and geographies. Now, the two fragments I'm going to share with you are written in a different rhetorical key. So I would love if you could pay attention to the tone and staging of the two pieces. My ambition, for better or worse, is necessarily diffuse, even didactic. The urgency here is to exude new idioms of the possible. In order to get my data, you have to use your imagination. So let me share an image and then we can begin the second section. Okay, so I want you to keep this image in mind as I read through. And if there are folks in the audience who read Kannada, which then you'll understand what I'm about to say even more. So this section is called We Are Saraswat's Caste. September 2012, a small enclave of the Samaj lies in Hubri, Dharwad, Karnataka, a bustling border city between Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka. So my mother, for example, was born in Hubri and therefore spoke Kannada, and as the reason why I do, and then moved to Shiroda because her mother was, of course, and like my mother, was part of a Devadasi network in which people moved between these three states. So in Hubri, members of the collectivity are much smaller, approximately 150 families or so, and are multiply categorized as I noted, Dalit, OBC, etc. As is the case with their counterparts in Maharashtra and Goa, the broader efforts of this group are also dedicated to their own reform, uplift, etc. Now, what remains relevant is that in this state, as in other states, the Samaj's shifting caste forms makes for a variegated and messy arena of reform and recognition. Now, as such, I'm in Hubri to conduct archival research and to speak to some of the living elders who have wills, property deeds, and various historical memorabilia. On the invitation of a member of the Samaj Council, Uday Barkar, I attend their monthly function held at the Samaj headquarters in the heart of Hubri. The function, as you can see here in the reading here, is a gathering of celebration and admonition, an achievement of this person here, a kalakar whose work is being lauded, even as the continued social and economic destitution of the community continues to be bemoaned. At this point, I'm pulled into the fray by an enthusiastic older Devadasin, Nirmalatai, who speaks to me about my research and asks me to remind the audience of the Samaj's enduring history of survival. Now, for any of you who have worked in India or elsewhere, know that if you are ever in a small space in which you are an ostensible expert, someone will ask you to give a bhashan, to give a speech, regardless of your expertise. So in this case, because I was a member of the Samaj and I was there, they were very keen that I speak to their community about our long history. Now, and she added, and Nirmalatai, to sweeten the deal, as it were, added very coquettishly, wagging her finger at me. In Kannada, she said, Namma, I'll just translate it. She said, tell them how beautiful our women are. Namma mahila yaru sundara tare, which is tell them how beautiful we are, right? Don't forget to tell them that. It is at this point that I noticed this banner up on the stage, a banner written, as many of you can read in Kannada, which reads Konkan Saraswat Samaj. Now, remember, the Samaj is called the Gomantak Mara Samaj. So in great consternation, baffled at what I think is surely an aspirational typo, I turn to Nirmala Tai and ask her to explain this banner to me. Surely, I ask, in my best imitation of a well-behaved historian, how is this going to appear in the archives if it's false as it represents our story? The banner, I say, suggests that we are Brahmins, and obviously we are not Saraswats. Without batting an eyelid and with a weary nod, Nirmala Tai looked at me and says, do you see what it says next to the banner right here? She says, this is the image of the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning. In Hubri, in the Konkan region, we are devotees of Saraswati and committed to learning. And so we are obviously Saraswats. That right does not belong to the Brahmins. Now, bemused by Nirmala Tai's casual explanation of what appears to be a rather imaginative leap of self-identification, I turn to Uday Barkar, who is the trustee, who's invited me, and I ask him the same question. Why does this say Konkan Saraswat Samaj? His explanation, too, echoed, albeit with some difference, much of what Nirmala Tai had said. Now, Barkar reminded me that the Hubri branch of the Samaj had deliberately chosen this name because they believed themselves to have come from the banks of the river Saraswati and as such were subjects. Now, remember, there is no archival evidence to support any of this claim about them emerging from the banks of the Saraswati. What I'm interested in more is why they choose this name and how they understand it. Now, when pressed on the historical details of this claim, Badkar remained unfazed and stated that these details were not relevant because this is what we believe we are. And in any case, I had any further doubts about their legitimacy as a collectivity. He noted with great pride and humor that even the dominant caste community in Hubri, the Chitrapur Saraswat Brahmin Samaj, had no choice but to respect their nominalization. With an ironic smile, he added, they have to accept us because their numbers are shrinking, and we, the Bahujans, are here now. Such acceptance, Badkar reminded me, did not alleviate caste discrimination or segregation. It did, however, fissure, meaning break upper caste access to visibility and recognition. Now, there's obviously a lot to share and say about this particular story, but let me remind you that such caste adjustments are not about wanting to be Brahmin, and neither do they rarely materialize change. But they appear throughout in the ways in which the Samaj conjures its own histories of belonging. Caste becomes marked by dissolution. The idea of Saraswat is no longer about blood lineage, but about learning and about access to a form of subjectivity that is denied. And caste also becomes visible by the very annulment of its evidentiary forms. How do we know who we are? Regardless of how the Samaj narrates its own nominalizations, one thing we do know, its archival presence in the official records. This Samaj in Hubri is registered as a charitable foundation in the archives, has a long registration number, and is registered as one Konkan Saraswat Samaj, legible for those people who are invested in data research as a Brahmin community. So 20 years from now or 50 years from now, if someone is doing research in Hubri, they will see the name of a Konkan Saraswat Samaj and maybe misread it as a Brahmin Samaj. But when they read their materials, will find out that something is clearly awry. Let me be clear, such cast of hand, if you will, are not aspirational forms. No one wants to be Brahmin here, or there is no attempt to forge an upper caste identity. The titular event comports more with the Samaj's broader epistemology that I began with, an abundance, a pretext for a different history of caste, an installation of descent, a reordering of the grammar of recognition and lineage. The Samaj's self-dedicated name, Konkan Saraswat Samaj, hovering somewhere between ordained caste structures and imaginative refurbishment, between evidence and kala, becomes magically liberated from the more burdensome data machine, that stultifying apparatus of rights and representation. Instead, we get translations of sexuality that thwart state demands for a compliant and intelligible history of caste. The data has changed. Who's a Brahmin now? I'm going to end with a very, very small section which was written during the pandemic. And of course, I'm happy to say more about its relationship to the CAA protests, the Hum Kaagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, etc. But I thought I would move forward. So let me end here. My apologies. Sorry, let me end here with this last image, which will take us to technology doesn't always behave in the ways in which we want. Okay, so we're going to stay with this image. This section, which I'm going to end with, is called I Remember You. I remember you, my mother always tenderly says to my partner Lucy, as she glimpses her across oceans, virtual and real, every week. My mother, a resolute Goan Kalavant, who never took to living in Bombay, is 85. Her memory faded and folded into crevices of stories told and untold. So I want you to keep this image in mind because it's an image of my mother when she was 16. And you can see, and it was taken in 1947. And you can see the image of Nehru, which is at the back, right? So the kind of shadowing of British India and Indian independence at the back is important. So I am talking about this particular moment. I remember you, my mother says, always tenderly. Her world, a map of the everyday life of sexuality, color, and caste, charts the realism of autofiction, where the past is always somewhere close at hand, the past as in the image and in her own body. In the pixelated landscape of my video screen, Ai's words linger, a translated rendering of how she manifests absence. I remember you, Mala tujhi aatwan yete, is her English condensation of that phrase, which makes aatwan a memory, an act of personal conjuring, a poignant tethering of past and present. I remember you too, Auntie, my partner Lucy always responds, sealing a treasured ritual of long-distance love that sutures affect to a history of memory. To remember here is not to grasp a lost past or surrender to nostalgia of a form, if there ever was one, but more an aspiration of belonging, to fashion a world, or at least a version of a world, that brings joy, Andolan, succor, and the possibility of a reunion. I thought often of Ai's phrase during the pandemic as I traveled several times to Mumbai to see her without her beloved Lucy, whose US passport made it impossible for her to enter a virus-stricken India. I thought about what it means to remember a history lost and unseen in a country besieged by memory disputes where little separates the factional from the fictional. Even as India buckled under the weight of rampant authoritarianism, communalism, casteism, and a general disregard for human life, I remember you. I remember the promises of liberation, the mandate to agitate, organize, and educate. I remember the farmers' protests, the words of Nodeep Kaur, the joyous rhythms of Shaheen Bagh, and the refusals of Bhima Koregaon and Muskan Khan. Today, and I wrote this towards the end of the pandemic in 22, but I know that these words remain resonant even in our current landscape. Today, as heartbreak still stretches across India, the inauguration of the Ram Mandir on January 22nd, 2024, endless deaths in Manipur and the Northeast, and the list goes on and on and on. Where more fires today are lit to cremate than to create, there are more memories to be made. From the searing faces of my Dalit Bahujan kin who tended the dead in the crematoriums of Hindutva making, to the oxygen langar that provides breath to the as yet living, we remember. A cremator in Delhi, at the center of India's COVID hell, the byline reads, weeps. He is, after all, the only witness, the only record of the living dead. Ashu Rai is his name, always a Dalit, yet now the bearer of last rites, of data unprocessed, of bodies unspoken. Quote, almost everyone asks about my caste because everyone wants a Brahmin to do the last rites, and not the Dalits, but the Brahmins are not available, end quote. Rai says, we are. Drenched in sweat, bearing wood, he takes one remaining piece of cloth, covering his face and head, and whispers laughingly, quote, this cloth absorbs my sweat, and when I hang it on my shoulder, people think I'm a Brahmin priest, end quote. I am a Dalit, I am a Dalit, I am the record of your loss. I am not your data, I am abundant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for that moving lecture and the prose towards the end. I think it is very important for us to acknowledge what is going on these days, and it's very saddening. But the first question that I would like to ask you is about the historian, and as a historian, are there or were there ethical demands that are placed upon historians when they engage with archives that have been complicit in the production of caste and sexual hierarchies, which you also pointed out, and can affect or intimacy serve as a methodological describing the liberal humanist troops, so to say?
Yeah, Ishan, that's a wonderful question, and it's a question that I think we should never stop thinking about. But I think what I wanted to suggest, not just through this book, but for example, through the book I'm writing right now on caste, sexuality, and indenture, is that even as we are alert, responsible, and accountable to the erasures of history, which we are. So remember, I'm not saying there's no loss. Loss is an ordinary syncopation of subaltern life. I could have written this book and talked only of the stories of caste humiliation that many in my community, including my parents, who were the first to be legally married, experienced. So that is not to say that is not there, but that's a condition of possibility, right? I wanted to say, what happens if we do not let those stories define us, which does mean those stories go away, right? They are in the everyday of our lives, right? Which is why I said, the example I gave is not about anyone wanting to be Brahmin. This community in Hubri is one of the most oppressed communities, and there is no way anyone is ever going to think about them as Brahmin if you were to be quote unquote phrenological, right? Like no one is going to look at my face. So the question of ethicality here is about interrogating our historical habits of reading. Right. So when I'm training young scholars or graduate students or myself all the time, is one of the things I have to ask myself is what are the kind of demands placed when I do certain kinds of histories, right? And obviously, when we do histories that are not hegemonic, what feminists, anti-caste scholars, queer scholars have taught us is that we need to have a hermeneutics of suspicion, meaning what? Read against the grain. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that has become, and many other people have. So nothing I'm saying here is extraordinarily original, right? I always keep company with so many other wonderful scholars who have already been doing this work, right? But one of the things they've taught us, and what I try to work out, is that these demands rely on a reading that takes certain categories for granted. Right. So if I'm reading something and saying, look, there's no representation of caste oppressed people, I have to know what caste means, right? And one of the things I've been trying to do, particularly through this work, and also because of my own lived history, is to say, look, caste is very messy. And it's messy in a way that we need to embrace. So this community, this is not a hagiographical book, right? For example, the first elected chief minister of Goa was Dayanand Bandorkar, who's a member of the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, but he was a lower caste capitalist. So most people in India don't know who he is, right? Now, my question and my invitation to you and all of us together is, how do we unmoor ourselves from a kind of script of oppositionality? Right? That we need our queers to be progressive. Most of them are not. We need our lower caste people to not vote for the BJP, as we are saying that is not the case, right? So we have to do better to understand what are the modalities of survival, right? And those are part of the story. And what are the things we're not willing to talk about, right? So when I wrote this book, many people from my own community were not pleased because they thought I was going to write a hagiographical history of what our Samaj is often referred to, right? Because people know Lata Mangeshkar, Kishori Amonkar, and I wanted to write about the ordinary lives of people like my mother, right? Who did not feature in any big story, but were the story I wanted to sell, keeping the subject alive, right? So I think the question of ethical demands is continuous. And that's why I invoke the question of Palestine, right? We are clearly in a moment, and this is true, has been true in India. We are clearly in a moment when evidence is not enough. I mean, who doesn't know evidence of Dalit brutality every single day? We hear of women being raped, assaulted. This is not a new thing. This is ordinary. But yet it is extraordinary in its missingness in the stories we tell of archival histories, right? We are seeing this in the genocide. Nobody will deny that there is not enough evidence of death and loss. But Palestinians will live on, right? Their efflorescence will continue. So I think our challenge is, as I said in my opening, état de grâce, état de rage. How do we create a relationship between a space of anger and rage and a space of grace and abundance? Both of them are true at the same time.
And how does the conceptual structuring of this caste and sexuality unsettle the conventional categories of historical analysis? And this is also in the we can add our subaltern idea of history. How does it also go against that in some ways? In what ways does this intervention that you are trying to make demand a rethinking of both subject formation as well as archival legibility? uh,
I would say that I am not against anything, right? I think an intellectual sort of writing of reactionary or contrary or oppositionality doesn't take us anywhere, right? So I don't think that I'm saying that we need to undo anything. I'm simply saying, let's think about our attachments to categories when we are doing anti-caste history or queer history, right? Remember, I'm bringing together two fields that rarely talk to each other, right? So queer studies, trans studies, and anti-caste studies are now beginning to come together a little bit, but it's more through the contemporary moment, right? Through the protests, through CAA, through all of, but there is a long history of thinking about this through the past, right?
yeah.
And there are many, my wonderful colleague Charu Gupta, who of course writes about these in a different vernacular, but I'm interested in saying, well, it's less about what we are not doing, but more about what it is that we're not allowing ourselves to see, right? So remember, an archive, anybody who's worked in archives, is always what is left behind. It is not what was, right? We know this. So the question is not about filling in the blanks, because the blanks will never be filled.
Correct.
The question is to say, well, when we say subaltern, and I'm a student of Spivak, so subaltern is not about just people who are oppressed. Subaltern is also about people who fall outside the lineages of representation, right? So I'm very careful not to use that term in this book because these folks mobilize representation and understand, right? So I'm saying we live in, I grew up in India. I grew up in Mumbai as a lower caste person. Everybody knows how to corrupt the language of evidence, right? This is ordinary common sense. And I'm not using the word jugaad because jugaad minimizes sometimes, right? But everyone who is grown up in the global south understands that evidence is inherently unreliable. But we also know that we need laws and representation, right? Those two things are true at the same time. So when I tick that box that says OBC, queer, whatever the category may be, I do so because I understand that it affords me some rights and representation, even as there's a section that I took out, as trans subjects and Dalit and Bahujan subjects came together during CAA, because they realized, and during the pandemic, because they realized, well, when COVID happened, the bodies that people didn't want were trans bodies because they wanted to put them in dead gendered spaces, or Dalit Bahujan bodies because they saw them as sources of contagion, right? Okay. So our challenge is not to decenter, you don't decenter anything, right? I mean, the kind of conceit of originality should be stripped away immediately. All we do is attenuate. We weaken the violence of the categories we've inherited, and the horizon remains, of course, annihilation, which we continue to fight for, not because we know what it is, but because we continue to imagine what it would be like, right? So I still think my conceptual infrastructure is less about installing new categories, but more about inviting us to meditate on how we ask the questions we ask, right? And when we think about caste, why do we think about? So this is a Bahujan historiography, right? Yeah. This is not a Dalit historiography, and I deliberately picked Bahujan as a term because it couples with the idea of abundance, right? The idea of Bahujan is an epistemological form. As an electoral form, it's a very different thing, right? And we certainly talk about that. And I wanted to remind us, as people like Gopal Guru, etc., have reminded us, that we have lost the kind of epistemological import of these forms, and we need to return them. And I wanted to think about it through the history of sexuality, which is not something that people go to, right? And that's where I remain pretty committed, is, the messiness is only possible because it emerges from a history of sexuality, because endogamy is at stake, right? And without endogamy, you don't have caste in the ways in which we understand it.
So you mentioned about archive. So can we conceptualize an archive as in it's a question with a lot of hopes. Can we conceptualize an archive that is capacious enough to hold this fugitive or non-normative or effectively change forms of descent without reproducing their erasure as could be the could be the case?
That's a wonderful question, and I'll respond by giving you an example. So, in the introduction of my book, which is called Make Believe, and it's not make believe to say fraud, it takes from a phrase that came out when I was doing, which is Amchi Karni Tumsa Vishwas, we will make you believe. One of the things that when I started doing my research, and this is to give you an answer to what would this archive look like, right? And that is not about, oh, you just got lucky because the Samaj collected its materials. Not at all, right? Is when I started going to the Samaj archives, even though I had grown up in them, I had never, of course, thought about it as a scholarly project until I had the maturity to think about it. I would see things falling apart in my hands, right? And my instinct, of course, because India, humidity, monsoon, lack of resources, was to go back with some Ziploc plastic bags and say, oh, let me put it in this to protect it. So remember, recovery, restoration, reparation. That's the mandate of historical work, right? This is what we learn. But in this case, that was thwarted because the curator of the archive said to me, she said to me, "Tu bhi kya karta? What are you doing?" And I said, well, I'm trying to save this. And she said, why? We have so much. Now, it wasn't as if they had so much, but in their mind, because they have always been producing, right? So as I said, that Goman, the Samaj Sudharak that I showed you images of, continues to this day. It's called the Goman Sharda because of some copyright issues. And it's like 5 pages, but it is still produced every single month without fail, right? So what would it mean to think of yourselves never worried about archival loss? To think about archives as existing in multiple forms. Like those images when the Kaka said to me, Amala Maitna, we don't know who she is, but this image, she looks like somebody from our family. So this is a way of thinking archival forms unmoored from the materiality of presence, which is made possible by a Brahminical or a colonial state, right? That's why Pangankar says, you want evidence? Let me give you an evidence, right? Let me stage something. But we are Kalavans, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's not about being a fraud or a con. It's about understanding why are we only visible when we have this name next to me? Why do you only see me as a Bahujan person if I say I'm Bahujan, given my face, given my accent, given the fact that I'm a person now of relative privilege, right? What are the ways in which we understand these forms, right? So archives also have stylizations, right? So in the 1930s, which is the efflorescence of reform movements, every Samaj has a magazine, a newsletter. So this Samaj decides we need a newsletter, right? So it's about, so this kind of archive that's capacious is about material for sure, but it's also about imagining different ways of telling our stories that are not about verification. So tomorrow, so the thing I began with is this event where this woman comes into the Samaj when I was doing research. For those of you who have not read the book, where she comes asking for a caste certificate for her son to get into engineering college because of reservations, something my brother also did. And I had never seen this process actually unfold. So I was like, okay, let me see what they do. So she comes in and the chitness, the secretary says, okay, let me go get the form. So I'm sitting there thinking, well, surely he's going to say, show me your son's birth certificate. Because not anybody can just walk in and say, give me a. So as if she was reading my mind, when he comes back, she says, don't you want to see my son's birth certificate? And this is where I got the title of my introduction. He says, no, we don't need your son's certificate. Amchi karni tumcha vishwas. Once I give you the certificate, you have to give me the right to publish your name in a list of members, which goes out annually. And as soon as he said that, she said no and walked away, because she wanted the evidentiary weight of the caste certificate so that her son could get in, but not the historical responsibility of belonging to that community. And from the Samaj, the evidence was irrelevant. You had to claim relationship, right? So imagine if that was the case, right? And I think in some ways, this is where I feel like queer history is also should learn and is an example of this, right? No one is asking you for your ration card when you enter a queer space and say, tell me when you had sex with whoever. That's absurd, right? It's a relationship of politics and identification, which is unmoored from the kind of fixity of identity, right? Now, again, let me reiterate, this does not mean the violence of identity does not exist. It exists all the time. But surrender to it is something that I'm asking us to reconsider.
In the previous answer, you also mentioned about Charu and the historical vernaculars, if we can call it. Uh, how does this invocation of historical vernacular suggest about the politics of language, if we can call it, and how might vernacular epistemologies kind of destabilize dominant liberal or the state-sanctioned narratives of the minoritized lives or marginalized voices?
First and foremost, I think that the idea of vernacular epistemologies is a very fraught one, right? Because as my dear colleague Geeta Patel has written, the term vernacular also emerged during the British colonial era as a term to devalue, right? And to devalue languages that, so one has to be also careful about how we use the term in value, right? But I think what I'm saying is yes, language makes a big difference. I mean, as most of your listeners probably know, and as Gopal and other people have written, Maharashtra is a very important place of anti-caste abolition in the 1930s, but the Marathi literary sphere is also super important at this moment. So I think that definitely sort of features, right, in the ways in which the Samaj mobilizes those histories of representation to talk about themselves. The early histories of sexology, Falke, all of them are also coming out of Maharashtra, right? So there is that. But I would also add, in addition to the importance of language, right? So for example, the Kannada is also important. But there are also some folks who speak Tulu. Now, Tulu, as some of you know, it doesn't have a written script, and if it's an oral language, and sometimes when it's written in Kannada, in the Kannada script, right? So there are kind of messiness of language, which certainly features, and of course the debates around Konkani, right? So
mm,
Konkani, so the archives are in Konkani, but Konkani can be written in Devanagari, in Roman script, and sometimes also in Hale Kannada, right? So language is not always just a one-to-one relationship with spoken and script. Sometimes that. So I think this collectivity is important because it brings in the question of comparative empires when we think about India, which is not something that we are trained to think about as much. So, for example, I'm working on Mauritius right now and Indian Ocean stuff, and French colonialism is as important because the laws in Mauritius are an admixture of British and French. And so
right.
indentured labor coming from India is surrendering to those forms as well, right? So Bhojpuri is not the Bhojpuri that's spoken in India. The Hindutva in Mauritius is not the Hindutva of India, right?
Mm, mm,
So languages are crucial, but we need to understand their comparative mobilization. So you could be doing Hindi and Marathi, but Marathi spoken by Dalit Bahujan people, as you know, would be very different, even if they were able to be literate and write, right? So that's one thing. And then the second thing is about destabilizing hegemony. I'm not sure about that because I think one of the things that, you know, the Dalit Studies Reader, for example, which is a collection that Ram Revat and others put together, I think has reminded us that oftentimes, you know, and this is why we have Bhima Koregaon, right?
mm,
That the relationship to oppositionality is often unwieldy, right? So you have Dalit Bahujan subjects who are working with the colonial state rather than with the Brahminical state, right? And colonial sort of anti-colonial independence movements, as you know, we already know, were often riven with caste and gender inequalities, right? So who is the referent for what we are destabilizing is not always clear. And for example, right now, my goal is as much to destabilize uh, hegemonic thinking as it is to destabilize left progressive thinking, right? Because this community is not, I don't want anyone to aspire to this community, right? I want us to think about what it is that we're unwilling to think about. What happens if caste is messy? What happens if caste and sexuality need to be considered? How do we then add on to these questions in ways that can help us learn a little bit more?
Before going to the audience question, I think the message is retracted for some reasons, but uh, so my last question for this is about the writing of history again, because we started with the question of historiography and the writing, the historian's craft, so to say. What role does this aesthetic language, if we can call it, like the musical metaphor that you mentioned, and the poetic gestures or the vernacular idioms, play in reframing how we write and think of history in context of violence and erasure? So,
Again, wonderful. These are all great questions. I would say that the kind of ruse of disciplinarity that has become so ever present, right? Meaning that, you know, I do history, you do literature, someone else, and, you know, and I think that ruse of disciplinarity was a production of the colonial state, right? I mean, if you
mm,
lead 18th, 19th century, you know, there are many, many scholars who've written about it. What is literature one day was history another. Not in the ways in which WhatsApp history is doing public history. That's not what I mean. But I mean that a poem would be considered a historical genre and an evidentiary genre in a certain period, depending on the value it was given, right? So one of the most important things I want to leave you and your audience with is how do we think about writing history as a
mm,
non-competitive form? Meaning what?
mm,
How do we create equal value between different genres? How do we think about a policy document having the same value as a poem, as is having the same value as a testimony? Not to say that they will have the same value in terms of judicial remedies, but in our own writing, right? How do we think about them in the same economy of value, right? So the writing of history, I'm a literary scholar who works in historical archives, right?
yeah.
I don't work in literary text at all. I work primarily in archives, but for me, an archive is always a figuration, meaning what? It is both a material form and an allegory for how we sit in the worlds in which we do. right? So the writing of history reflects that. And I think, most of people writing history now understand this or have to, right? Because otherwise, especially for those of us who work in South Asia, those things are being taken away from us,
Yeah.
right? And I know that you all staged a debate on public history. We know that the idea of what public history is completely gone awry, right? So it's, instead of giving up ground, we need to take up more ground and say all of these, my WhatsApp conversation with you could be an archival form if I render it in an ethical and responsible way, right? So don't trash WhatsApp history. Think about it as as an archival form, right? That generates one version of history, which we are unhappy with, but it's an archival form. And hopefully 50 years from now, people will understand its fraudulent and unreliable status. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for taking out time this evening for us and morning for you to talk about this very important issue of the archives. And I hope that we have the archives that we imagine, and that we create more such archives of voices that are on the verge of erasure now. And Gomantak Maratha Samaj archives that you mentioned is one rare case, as we kind of got to know. But I hope that there are many more such archives. As you say, you know, the contemporary archives are also very important, where the farmers movement created an archives of their own using the newspapers that they made, the trolley times and all those things.
Of course.
I hope that more social movements create those kinds of archives for many, many scholars who are listening to us right now and who will listen to this conversation later on. Um, one can only hope for better times in during times like these. These are not the best of times, but वो सुबह कभी तो आएगी is what Sahir and Fez and other great writers, poets wrote. So with that thought, thank you so much for doing this, and I really hope, we really wish that the book comes out very soon and we get to read.
The book is
Uh,
out already. This is for my second book. Yes.
yeah, the second book. And those who want to read Abundance, the link will be up on the YouTube video in the description section after this live. So do check it out. Please get your copies and read. As I always say, keep thinking, keep reading, keep questioning. That's how you'll keep yourself sane in these insane times. Jai Bhim, and thank you so much.
Jai Bhim, and have a good day. Thank you.